You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
On a fall evening in 1996, a young detective sped through the streets of Tucson, Arizona, towards an upscale country club. All he knew was that someone had reported an explosion in the area, but he didn't know what had caused it. Minutes later, the detective pulled into the country club parking lot, and as he got out of his car, it almost felt like he had stepped into a war zone. Car alarms were blaring, shattered glass covered the ground, and nearby, he saw a car with its roof completely ripped off. The young detective quickly got to work searching the scene, having no idea that he would spend the next 13 years of his life trying to close this case, which would span across the United States and all the way to Europe. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, when the follow button has finally made it to the last level of Candy Crush, politely ask to borrow their phone for a second just to make a quick call. But instead of making a call, permanently delete the Candy Crush app on their phone. Okay, let's get into today's story. At about 5 p.m. on November 1st, 1996, 52-year-old Gary Triano stood on the 18th green at the La Paloma Country Club in Tucson, Arizona. Gary crouched down to line up a short putt, while three of his friends stood off to the side, giving him a hard time for taking so long. Gary just blocked them out. Almost everywhere else, Gary was known for being loud, impulsive, and never slowing down. But on the golf course, he always felt calm and focused. Gary stood back up and prepared to take the shot. He took a breath, brought his putter back just a little, and swung. His friends shouted like that might knock the ball off course, but Gary watched it roll across the green and drop right into the hole. Gary let out a huge yell and thrust his fist into the air in celebration. He turned to his friends and looked at them like they were crazy to think they could beat him. Gary grabbed the ball out of the hole, slipped his club into his golf bag, slung it over his shoulder, and then followed his friends into the country club bar. It was a few days before Gary's 53rd birthday, and he thought there was no better way to celebrate than with a round of golf and a drink with his friends. But what Gary didn't know was that this golf game was actually part of a bigger plan. Gary's girlfriend had arranged this game with his friends, and she'd gotten some other friends to invite him out to a different bar at 6 p.m., all so she could get Gary's house ready for a huge surprise party she was throwing him later that night. Gary and his friends took a seat at the bar and ordered some drinks. And as they did, they all bragged about the best shots they had made that day. The bartender handed Gary his drink, but before he could take a sip, he heard someone calling Mr. Triano behind him. Gary turned, and he saw a young woman in her mid-20s coming his way, and his face just lit up. It had been years since he had last seen her, but he recognized her immediately. She was one of his daughter's friends from when they were young. Gary stepped away from the bar, and the young woman hugged him like she was hugging her own father. Gary asked how she was doing, and he wanted to know all about her life. The two talked for a few minutes while Gary's friends drank at the bar. They were all very used to hearing somebody call out Gary's name, no matter where they went, because it seemed like everybody in Tucson knew him. And in truth, Gary was really well known around the city. He had been a big-time real estate investor, he'd opened casinos, and he'd run businesses in a bunch of different industries. And before he'd gotten divorced from his second wife, a socialite named Pamela Phillips, they ran in the same circles as Hollywood celebrities and well-known politicians. The young woman hugged Gary again and said how great it was to see him, and she went outside as Gary made his way back to the bar. He glanced at his watch. It was almost 5:30, and so it was just about time for him to head to the next bar to meet his other group of friends. So he threw back his drink and then reached into his pocket, pulled out several bills, and carefully folded them into little origami flowers. He put these flowers on the bar for a tip, then grabbed his golf bag, shouted goodbye to everyone, and walked out. Gary's friends waved him off and then just kind of shook their heads. Gary couldn't help himself. He always had to make a grand exit. The sun was setting when Gary stepped outside, and so he looked out at the pink and red sky over the mountains and desert in the distance. It was a beautiful day, just about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and Gary smiled. It was perfect days like this that had helped the Tucson real estate market boom, and Tucson real estate had once made him millions of dollars. But now, standing there, thinking about his money, all he could do was laugh, or he'd just get depressed. Despite the continued growth of the real estate market, the last few years had been tough on Gary financially. He had spread himself too thin, investing in too many high-risk ventures, and some of the deals he'd made had completely fallen apart and cost him a huge chunk of his fortune. In order to deal with these massive losses, Gary had recently filed for bankruptcy, and now he was slowly trying to rebuild his wealth. But Gary quickly shook all of this off. From the time he was a young man, he had really believed that no matter what happened to him, he would always land on his feet. And even though he was not making the kind of money he'd made in the past, and his life wasn't as exciting as it was when he and his socialite ex-wife were hanging out with famous people, Gary still just loved being here in Tucson. He traveled all over and gone to lavish parties in some of the biggest cities in the world, but at the end of the day, nothing could beat a perfect Arizona sunset over the mountains and the desert. Gary walked across the country club parking lot to his 1989 Lincoln Town Car. He tossed his golf bag in the back and got into the driver's seat. He was about to take off when something caught his eye. There was a small wooden box in the floorboard of the passenger seat. His girlfriend must have gotten him an early birthday present and somehow hidden it in the car without him noticing until now. Gary smiled, reached down, and grabbed the box. As Gary was getting into his car, the bar inside the country club was getting louder. More people had just come in from the golf course, and everybody was talking and laughing. But suddenly, a huge bang echoed over all that noise. The glasses behind the bar rattled, and some people hit the floor, trying to take cover. They had no idea what was happening. A nearby transformer might have blown, or they could be in the middle of an earthquake. Nobody knew. But one man at the bar, who happened to be a doctor, took off running towards the parking lot, and Gary's friends and some others followed. And when they got outside, they felt like they had just stepped into a war zone. Car alarms blared, they saw smoke rising into the air, they saw cars with shattered windshields, and they saw a Lincoln Town Car with its windows blown out, its doors shredded, and its roof completely ripped off. The doctor ran right to that car, hoping that nobody was inside. But as he got closer, he could see a man sprawled out in the front seat, and most of this man's clothes had been torn off his body, and he looked burned and bloody. The doctor turned around and shouted for the people who had followed him to call 911 and to stay back. He didn't know if they were all still in danger, and even if they weren't, he didn't want anyone to see what he was looking at inside of that car. The doctor leaned in through the space where the car window used to be. He reached down and grabbed the man's bloody wrist. The explosion that had shaken the bar inside must have killed this man instantly. Detective James Gamber of the Pima County Sheriff's Department was clearing the dinner table and putting dishes in the sink at his house when his phone rang. He walked across the kitchen and answered it. It was one of his colleagues from the Sheriff's Department, and this colleague said that there had just been an explosion at La Paloma Country Club, and Gamber needed to get down there right away. So Detective Gamber ran out to his car and sped off through his residential neighborhood. Gamber had only been a homicide detective with the Sheriff's Department for a short time. In fact, he had only worked one homicide case at this point. But as he drove to the country club, he had no idea if he was even heading to the scene of a murder. For all he knew, the explosion he was racing towards could have been caused by an accident of some kind. A few minutes later, Gamber pulled into the La Paloma parking lot, and he saw first responders everywhere. He also saw a different group of people, many of them in golf clothes, standing with two police officers near the main entrance of the club. The detective got out and walked over towards the first responders, and as he did, the scene in the parking lot almost didn't seem real to him. He stepped over shattered glass, and he thought he saw a car windshield stuck up in a tree, and when Gamber got to the car where the majority of first responders were and he looked inside of it, he knew he was not dealing with an accident. There was no doubt in his mind that a bomb had gone off in that car. Gamber stared down at the mangled body in the front seat. He glanced over at the first responders, and even they looked completely shaken. They had seen people who had been pulled from fires, but none of them had seen a man who had been killed by a bomb. The detective looked back at the body, and he saw something that just seemed odd. It looked like this man's clothes had been ripped off by the sheer force of the blast, but his watch had stayed on his wrist. So Gamber leaned further into the car to get a better look. The glass on the man's watch had cracked, and the watch had stopped at 5:38. And Gamber couldn't really explain it, but seeing the watch really hit him hard. It was like this man's last moment on Earth was frozen in time. Gamber stepped away from the car and walked over to the crowd of people standing out front. He briefly spoke to the other officers, and then he started taking statements from everyone. And almost all of them knew the dead man in the car, and they said his name was Gary Triano. Detective Gamber continued to gather information on Gary from the people at the club, and he learned a little about Gary's current girlfriend and what people called Gary's larger-than-life attitude. As Gamber wrote everything down in his notebook, he heard sirens blaring and cars and vans speeding down the street towards the parking lot. He looked out onto the street, and he quickly realized this case was about to get a lot bigger than anything he'd ever worked on. Because most of the vehicles heading this way did not belong to the Pima County Sheriff's Department or the local police. They belonged to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And within minutes, Gamber watched as federal agents from the FBI and ATF swarmed the parking lot and took control of the crime scene. After Gamber finished his interviews, he walked away from the club entrance, but he hung back and just watched the activity in the parking lot. This crime scene had overwhelmed him when he arrived, and now there were law enforcement officers from multiple agencies searching the lot, and forensics and explosives experts from the ATF and FBI searching Gary's car. Gamber honestly wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. Finally, amidst all of this, he spotted his boss, the Pima County Sheriff. So he weaved his way past federal agents towards Gary's car and approached the sheriff, who looked kind of overwhelmed himself. The sheriff told Gamber that several of the federal agents he'd spoken to thought there was a chance that this had been a professional mob hit. Technicians had already found fragments in and around the car that they believed were from a homemade incendiary device, and they thought this device could be the type of bomb often used by the mafia. This actually all made sense to Detective Gamber because he knew that the mafia had been prevalent in this area since back in the 1970s. But Gamber wanted to know what their department's role was in all of this. Clearly, the FBI and ATF were running things here, and if the mafia was involved, both of those agencies would probably run the entire case for a while. The sheriff said their department would coordinate with the feds, but he told Gamber that it was still the homicide unit's job to pursue this like they would any other murder case. So Gamber told his boss if the FBI and ATF were going to start looking into big-time suspects like organized crime families, then he wanted to start on a much smaller scale. And right now, that meant talking to the person who would almost always be the first suspect in a murder investigation, the victim's romantic partner. A little over an hour after the explosion, a woman stepped out of her car and approached the country club parking lot. She looked almost like she was sleepwalking, like she didn't see all the chaos around her. Local police officers immediately stopped the woman from walking any further into the parking lot, and she shouted that she was Gary's girlfriend. Detective Gamber saw this happening. He'd been waiting for her. A police officer had called her at Gary's house to inform her about what had happened. At first, she didn't believe the cop. She said Gary was out with his friends, and then he was going to come home for a huge surprise party she was throwing him. But eventually, she had accepted the truth, and she said she was coming to the country club right away. Gamber rushed over to her and introduced himself. He said how sorry he was, and he hated to put her in this position right now, but he needed to ask her some questions. Gary's girlfriend looked back at him, still with this glazed expression, and said she would try to help. Gamber glanced down at a few notes he'd scribbled in his notebook. He knew the doors on Gary's car had been so badly damaged by the blast that it was impossible to tell if someone had broken into the car to plant the bomb. But people had been in and out of the parking lot all day, and so far, nobody had reported witnessing a break-in. So, Gamber thought there was a good chance that whoever planted the bomb had easy access to Gary's car, so he asked Gary's girlfriend if she had keys to the Lincoln. She said she did, but she said it didn't really make a difference because Gary always left his car unlocked. This threw Gamber off. Somebody leaving their car unlocked, especially a nice car like Gary's, sounded like something that only happened back in the 1950s. But Gary's girlfriend said that he had this foolish belief that nothing bad would ever happen to him, and that people were actually good at heart. She said if it wasn't for her, he very likely would have just left his house unlocked every night. Gamber continued to talk to Gary's girlfriend for a few more minutes. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but this woman really did seem completely shocked by Gary's death. So he told her, before he let her go, that he just wanted to know if she could think of anyone in Gary's life who might have wanted to harm him. Gary's girlfriend shook her head. She said Gary had a good relationship with both of his ex-wives and his 2 grown children from his first marriage, and the children from his second marriage were still pretty little, and she said everybody who knew Gary loved him. He was generous and fun. Suddenly, Gary's girlfriend trailed off, and the look on her face totally changed, like she had just thought of something. Gamber asked if something was wrong, and she nodded. There was one past relationship in Gary's life that had ended badly, and it just continued to get worse. She said Gary had an ex-girlfriend named Robin Gardner, and Gary had left her when she got pregnant. But even before that, Gary had wanted to get out of the relationship because Robin had a temper and had once attacked him with a flower vase. Gamber asked if Gary had had any contact with Robin lately. Gary's girlfriend said that Robin had called a few months earlier, and she left Gary a message on the machine. And all Robin had said was, "You're going to pay. Someday, you're going to pay." The day following the bombing, FBI and ATF agents remained focused on possible mob ties to Gary's murder, while Detective Gamber drove to meet Gary's ex-girlfriend, Robin, at her house. By this time, the bombing was all over the news in the region, so Robin was well aware that Gary had died. Robin opened the door, holding her baby girl in her arms, and she led the detective into the kitchen, where her new husband was already sitting at the table. Gamber took a seat, and he didn't waste any time. He said he knew that Robin had once physically assaulted Gary because Gary had called 911 and asked police to remove her from his house. Gamber also knew about the threatening phone message she had left him. Robin's face immediately turned red, and she looked very embarrassed. She said she couldn't justify her actions, but Gamber clearly did not have the full story. When she had gotten pregnant, Gary had openly doubted that the baby was his. He broke up with her and didn't want any responsibility for the child, so she lashed out because she was hurt and scared and didn't know if she'd be able to provide for her baby on her own. But after the baby was born and a paternity test proved that she was Gary's daughter, Gary had said he would help take care of her financially, and Robin and Gary's relationship became a lot more civil. The baby started crying a little, and Robin asked if she could excuse herself. Gamber said of course, and Robin carried the baby out of the kitchen. Her husband watched to make sure she was out of earshot, and then he leaned toward Gamber and spoke quietly. He said there was no doubt that his wife had a temper. If Robin was mad, she made it really clear. But despite the issues she'd had with Gary, Robin's husband said that she told him that Gary was a good man for admitting he was wrong and doing his part to make sure the baby was taken care of. By the time Gamber left the house, he didn't feel like Gary's ex-girlfriend or his latest girlfriend were the likely killers. He didn't want to eliminate any suspects until he had more clear evidence, but he knew Gary's ex-wives and his grown children could also have a motive to kill Gary. And all of them most likely knew about Gary's strange habit of keeping his car doors unlocked, so they would know how easy it would be to place a bomb in the Lincoln town car. During the week following the bombing, Detective Gamber checked in often with the sheriff and with the FBI and ATF. The feds were still tracking leads connected to the mafia, and they were delving deep into Gary's financial records. It had become clear that Gary had racked up millions of dollars in debt, and he owed people money all over the world, so they were even following international leads. But all of the agencies believed Detective Gamber's investigation held just as much weight as theirs. It was still entirely possible that Gary's murder was personal and had nothing to do with his business dealings. So Gamber arranged separate interviews with Gary's 2 ex-wives, but both of these meetings played out almost exactly the same way. All Gary's first wife, Mary, and his second wife, the socialite Pamela, really told Gamber was that they loved Gary, thought he was a great father, and they had remained good friends with him after their divorces. They were also both heartbroken by Gary's death. After meeting Mary and Pamela, Detective Gamber did not feel like he had any new information about the case, and he was already starting to get frustrated. Gary's somewhat tangled romantic life had seemed like a strong lead, but his relationships with his ex-wives appeared to have both been pretty healthy. And even as Gary had started to struggle financially, he always paid his child support, so that was not a cause for conflict. And Gamber also had to admit that both women had really solid alibis. Neither of them had been in town when Gary died. Following the meetings with the ex-wives, Gamber interviewed Gary's son and daughter from his first marriage, who were both in their mid-20s, and he hoped they would give him something to go on. But they would both say that Gary was a great dad and an amazing friend. He meant everything to them. They admitted that when they were teenagers and their parents got divorced, they had blamed their dad at first, but they ended up loving their stepmom and their two little half-siblings, so any animosity they felt towards their dad had disappeared. And so in about the span of a week, Gamber had met with the people he believed had the clearest personal motives to kill Gary, but he felt like he still hadn't gotten anywhere. At the same time, the federal investigations also seemed to be stalling. There were plenty of leads, but each one of them fell apart under the slightest bit of scrutiny. So, as November came to an end, everyone involved in the hunt for Gary's killer worried that the case was already drying up, and that the killer, who had set off a homemade bomb in the city of Tucson, would remain free and out on the streets. In early December, about a month after Gary's murder, Detective Gamber got a phone call at his desk. And as soon as the man on the line began talking, Gamber could hear the urgency in his voice. The man said he was an investigator from Aspen, Colorado. He'd just seen a news report about Gamber's ongoing investigation, and he had some strange pieces of evidence that he thought might be connected to the car bombing. When Gamber heard this, he felt like he'd just woken up after a long night of sleep. This was the first time he'd been excited about this case in weeks. The Colorado investigator said he'd been working a fraud case for months, trying to track down a man named Ron Young. Ron had bilked a bunch of people out of thousands of dollars. And back in October, this investigator had found an abandoned minivan in California that Ron had rented. Inside the van, the investigator said he'd found a sawed-off shotgun. He'd also found some potential evidence that he didn't really understand at the time. But after seeing the news report about this car bombing, he thought that evidence he found might finally make sense. Gamber was now standing up at his desk, just waiting with anticipation to hear what this evidence was. The investigator said he had found a map of Tucson, Arizona, and a piece of paper with some names on it. And one of those names was Gary Triano. Gamber felt his hands shaking. He wanted to run out of the station and go find Ron Young right away. So he asked the investigator to please send over all the information he had on him. The investigator said he would do that as soon as they hung up, but he gave Gamber a warning. He said Ron was elusive, and tracking him down would not be easy. Throughout the end of 1996 and the first several months of 1997, Detective Gamber worked with the FBI to try to locate Ron. But after months of searching, Gamber started to feel like the investigator from Colorado had made a huge understatement. Ron was not just elusive, this man was a ghost. None of Ron's family or friends, or anyone he knew, seemed to have any idea where he was. He might as well have just dropped off the face of the earth. And even with Gamber and the FBI coordinating with state and local authorities across the country, they could not get a viable lead on Ron's location. During this time, the other aspects of the investigation had also hit a wall, and so even the federal agencies believed that finding Ron was their only real option for keeping the case going. But as more time went by and they still could not find Ron, Gamber started to get this sick feeling that Gary's killer would never be found and his family would never get closure. And for Gamber, who was still so new to the homicide unit, this felt like a total failure. And by early summer of 1997, about 7 months after Gary's murder, there was still no sign of Ron, and Detective Gamber's fears came true. The interagency task force that had been working on the case disbanded. The feds left, and Gary's murder was no longer considered a top priority for the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Gamber did his best to try to return to the case files whenever he could, but he soon had other homicide investigations to lead. And then Gary's murder almost completely disappeared from the news, and the case went cold for a very long time. On November 19, 2005, 9 years after Gary's murder, a chiropractor in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, came home after a day of work, sat down on his couch, and turned on one of his favorite TV shows, America's Most Wanted. At the time, America's Most Wanted was a very popular show that featured stories about criminals who were still at large, in the hope that the viewers of the show might provide tips that could help lead to an arrest. The chiropractor watched the show and listened to a story about a man who was wanted in a fraud case and had possible connections to a murder. And as the chiropractor watched, he suddenly got off the couch and got closer to his TV to make sure he was really seeing what he thought he was seeing. There was an image of the criminal on the screen. Now, the chiropractor didn't recognize the criminal's name, Ron Young, but he definitely recognized the man, because he had treated this man's bad back on several different occasions. The chiropractor grabbed his cell phone from his pocket and dialed the number for the America's Most Wanted tip line. 2 days later, federal and local law enforcement arrested Ron Young in Fort Lauderdale. And days after that, Detective Gamber, who was still a homicide detective, along with other Pima County investigators, flew to Florida to question Ron in connection to the bombing that killed Gary Triano. Detective Gamber felt exhilarated to have the case reopened. He had always regretted that he had not been able to bring Gary's killer to justice, but Gamber would soon realize that he still had a long way to go. Ron repeatedly denied having anything to do with Gary's murder, no matter how much police pressured him. And so it would take several more years of coordinated efforts between law enforcement organizations across the country and multiple international agencies for investigators to gather evidence to prove that Ron knew a lot more than he was willing to say, and that there was someone else out there on the run who was directly connected to Gary's murder. 4 years later, on a cold December night in Vienna, Austria in 2009, now 13 years after Gary's murder, members of Austria's federal police force approached an upscale hotel located in one of the wealthiest parts of the city. The lead officer and his partner found the room they were looking for and knocked on the door. When the door opened, the lead officer spoke in German, but the person at the door looked confused. So the officer quickly switched to English and asked them to identify themselves. And when the lead officer heard this person's name, he told them that they were under arrest for the murder of Gary Triano. Soon after this arrest, the lead officer contacted his supervisor, who then got in touch with federal authorities in the United States to start the extradition process. That process took months, but when the suspect was back in Arizona, Detective Gamber interviewed them. And by the time that interview ended, all of Gamber's hard work had finally paid off. After 13 years, he now knew who had murdered Gary. Based on evidence collected over the course of the entire investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Gary on November 1st, 1996. At around 4:15 p.m. that day, the bomber sat at a small table in a hotel room, breathing in slowly over and over until they could feel their heart rate slowing down. When they felt completely calm, they reached out, picked up the homemade bomb they had spent days putting together, and then slowly placed it into an open wooden box laying on the table. They secured the bomb inside the box and then walked across the room and grabbed the phone. They took a small piece of paper out of their pocket with a number scrawled on it and dialed. A friendly young man at the front desk of the La Paloma Country Club answered and asked how he could help. The bomber, using an equally friendly voice, asked the young man if Gary Triano was out on the golf course. The young man said he was. He said he had welcomed Gary into the club a little while earlier. After that, the bomber hung up the phone and walked back to the table, picked up the box with the bomb in it, and walked out to their car. They set the box in the passenger seat and then drove slowly down the road. No need to take any stupid chances by driving fast. A few minutes later, the bomber pulled into the La Paloma parking lot. They spotted Gary's Lincoln Town Car and pulled into a spot that was as far away as they could get while still maintaining a clear view of Gary's car. The bomber scanned the lot and they didn't see anyone. So they opened their car door, went around to the other side, and carefully picked up the box with the bomb inside of it. They kept their head down as they walked to Gary's car. When they got there, they saw that the passenger side door was unlocked. They opened the door, crouched down, and placed the box on the floorboard. The bomber closed Gary's car door and quickly walked back to their car and climbed inside. And then they watched and waited. At around 5:30 p.m., they saw Gary step out of the country club. The bomber reached into their pocket and slipped out a small remote control. As they watched Gary get closer to his car, their heartbeat got faster. Gary climbed into his car, and after a second, the bomber watched as Gary leaned down towards the floorboard. And at that moment, the bomber hit a button on that remote. the bomber heard a loud bang and saw the roof of Gary's car go flying into the air. In the chaos, the bomber sped out of the parking lot and drove to a nearby payphone. They dropped a coin in, and when the person answered, the bomber said the job was done. The person on the other side of the call didn't say anything. They just hung up the phone and smiled at their 2 little children who were playing nearby. Ron Young, the man who had eluded authorities for years before getting caught by a chiropractor watching TV, built the bomb and placed it inside of Gary's car. But Ron was not the person who had set any of this in motion. Gary's second wife, the socialite Pamela Phillips, was the one behind everything. It turned out that despite what Pamela had told the police, she was not happy about her relationship with her ex-husband. Because ever since Gary had begun experiencing financial difficulties, he stopped giving Pamela the type of money he had given her in the past. Gary still paid child support and alimony, but there was nothing extra for her like there used to be. And so Pamela had decided that the only way she could get the kind of money from Gary that she wanted was by killing him. Because Gary had taken out a $2 million life insurance policy, and he had made Pamela and his 2 kids the beneficiaries. But until those kids turned 18, Pamela would receive the payout if Gary died, with the understanding that she would manage and invest the money for the kids. But Pamela just wanted the money for herself and did not want to wait any longer. So she offered a man she'd once had a romantic relationship with, Ron Young, $400,000 to do the job. Ron already had a criminal past, and he had some experience with explosives. So together, Pamela and Ron started planning Gary's murder, and they decided to use a homemade bomb. And in the fall of 1996, they found the perfect way to carry out their plan. Gary's girlfriend had wanted everyone in Gary's family to come to the surprise party she was planning. So she had invited Pamela and the kids, and even told Pamela her plan to keep Gary out of the house. He was going to play golf at La Paloma until around 5:30, and then go to another bar before coming home. So, Pamela now had the perfect time and place for Ron to pull off the murder. She knew exactly where Gary was going to be, and she knew Gary never locked his car doors, so Ron would have no problem finding the car and planting the bomb. This all took years for Detective Gamber and investigators to put together, mainly because Ron had been so difficult to hunt down and to get any information from. But when they finally had him in custody and started getting closer to connecting Pamela to the murder, she took off to Europe. It took a while, but eventually, law enforcement agencies in Austria found her staying at a high-end hotel in Vienna. So they arrested her and sent her back to the United States. Ron Young and Pamela Phillips were both found guilty of murder and conspiracy. Ron received 2 life sentences without possibility of parole. Pamela received life in prison plus 25 years, also with no possibility of parole. And because of the amount of time this investigation took, it was both Detective Gamber's second homicide case and his last. He retired from the force not long after having helped solve Gary's murder. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you like today's story and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all our studio's podcasts. They are this one, the MrBallen podcast. We also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and also Runful. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories, just like the one you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
I just woke up from a dream, but you and I had to say goodbye. And I don't know what it all means, but since I survived I realized wherever you go, that's where I'll follow. Nobody's promised tomorrow, so I'ma love you every night like it's the last night, like it's the last night. If the world was ending, I'd wanna be next to you. If the party was over and our time on earth was through, I'd wanna hold you just for a while and die with a smile. If the world was ending, I'd wanna be next to you. Ooh, lost in the words that we scream. I don't even wanna do this anymore, 'cause you already know what you mean to me, and our love's the only one worth fighting for. Wherever you go, that's where I'll follow. Nobody's promised tomorrow, so I'ma love you every night like it's the last night, like it's the last night. If the world was ending, I'd wanna be next to you. If the party was over and our time on earth was through.
Sheena Bora walked through the big iron gates of St. Xavier's College in Mumbai, India, and looked up in awe at the grand cathedral-like buildings that rose up all around her. It was July 2006, and it was Sheena's first day of college. The 19-year-old had worked hard all through high school, even taking extra classes in the evenings to make sure she remained at the top of her class. Her favorite subjects were math and science, and so at St. Xavier's, she had decided to major in economics, which is a subject that includes elements of both math and science. On this July day, Sheena wore leggings under a flowing deep blue top that covered her shoulders, in keeping with St. Xavier's strict dress code. But even dressed modestly, Sheena was very beautiful. She had long dark hair, big brown eyes, and a wide, sweet smile. But she was shy and nervous, and she didn't know anyone at the school yet, so to avoid any awkward interactions with new people, she intentionally walked quickly and kept her eyes looking straight ahead. As she hustled deeper into the sprawling campus, Sheena passed through a garden with palm and mango and papaya trees, and then she walked under a graceful stone arch engraved with the name of the school. Just past that archway, Sheena checked in at the security desk, and then she turned right and walked toward the middle of the campus, which was an open plaza centered on a Gothic chapel with tall green stained glass windows. When she reached the place, Sheena stopped to look around. It was packed with students laughing and shouting, and for a second, she was overcome with amazement at where her life had taken her. Until just a few months earlier, Sheena had had little hope for her future. She was a poor girl from a crowded city called Guwahati, located almost 2,000 miles to the east of her new college. Her family counted every rupee, which is Indian money, and some nights dinner was just rice. But now, here she was at one of the very best colleges in India. St. Xavier's had everything: state-of-the-art computer labs, a library with more than 1 million books, and it even had its own museum. The school admitted only about 1,000 undergraduate students each year, and now Sheena was one of those lucky few. Sheena took one more look at all the people in the plaza and then started walking again. She crossed to the other side of the plaza and walked inside of a stone 4-story building. After going upstairs to the second floor, Sheena turned down a long white hallway, and when she reached the end of it, she saw a sign hanging over a door on the left-hand side that read Multimedia Room. This was where her first class was scheduled to be. Sheena opened the door and stepped inside, but it was empty. She was the first person to arrive. The room was huge, with high ceilings, brand new desks, and a big video screen down in front for the teacher to use. Sheena sat down at a desk in the front row. She pulled a notebook and pen out of her bag, and then after tucking the bag back under her seat, Sheena began to wait. After a few minutes, Sheena heard the door open behind her, and she turned around and saw other students starting to file inside. The room eventually filled up with more than 100 people, with almost every desk taken. Then, after all the students had arrived, the professor came in, walking quickly and swinging a briefcase. He walked down the middle aisle until he reached the front of the class, where he put his briefcase down on the table, he wrote his name on the whiteboard, then he turned to face the class. A few minutes after that, Sheena was furiously scribbling notes down and listening to her classmates ask and answer questions about economic theory. Sheena smiled. She loved college already. But even though her initial impression of college was a good one, Sheena knew it was going to take some time to get adjusted to her new life in Mumbai. It was already so much different than the life she had always known in Guwahati. But over the following days and weeks, Sheena would get more comfortable with her surroundings, and she would even muster the courage to start casual conversations with her new classmates. And it would turn out, despite her shy demeanor, Sheena's classmates were very much drawn to her. Sheena was a good listener, she was kind, and she worked incredibly hard. And in time, Sheena would have a little core group of friends that she shared notes with and ate lunch with at the campus cafe. And it wasn't just students that took a liking to Sheena. Her professors liked her as well. Sheena always went above and beyond on every assignment she was given. One time, when a class required data about a little rural town, Sheena actually traveled the 250 miles to the town to find the data herself instead of using old information posted online. But despite how well-liked Sheena was, there was something very odd about her that her classmates and her professors noticed about her almost immediately. And that was all the mysterious phone calls she got. Sheena would be sitting in one of her classes in her regular spot right up front, diligently taking notes and completely focused on the subject matter, and then her phone would vibrate. She'd reach down, rummage through her bag under her feet, and check to see who was calling, and there was one name that, if she saw it on her screen, would change Sheena's entire demeanor. She would instantly pack up her things, nod a quick, silent apology to her professor, and then rush out of the classroom without telling anyone what was going on. When her friends asked her about these calls, Sheena would just say that it was her older sister, Indrani, who was calling her, and that Indrani was just overprotective and sometimes needed Sheena to come home right away. Sheena's friends didn't really understand this, but when they tried to fish for more information, Sheena would just start acting uncomfortable and try to change the subject. In fact, Sheena never really talked about her family or personal life at all. Her friends could sense it was a painful topic, and they were right. What Sheena didn't share widely was that before she had come to Mumbai, her life was very troubled, and not just because her family did not have much money. When Sheena and her little brother Mikhail were just babies, their mother abandoned them. Sheena's mother had always dreamed of fame and riches, and so when she got the opportunity to go to a big city to study, she took it, leaving her kids behind. And so Sheena and her brother had grown up in a little house in a narrow alleyway with their grandparents. The grandparents had tried their best, but it was very hard. Mikhail had mental health issues, and Sheena was always sad because she missed her mother terribly. Sheena would write about her mother in her diary. Some days she would wonder about why her mother had not come back. Did she not love her children? Other days, Sheena would find herself dreaming of doing exactly what her mother had done, leaving and going to college in a big city. And it was Indrani, the overprotective older sister, who always called in the middle of Sheena's classes, who had made Sheena's college dream come true. Indrani was about 15 years older than Sheena. She had left Guwahati years earlier, determined to make a better life for herself, and with her charm and fierce work ethic, she had done it. She was glamorous and beautiful, and just recently married to a man named Peter Mukherjee, who ran India's most successful TV network and who had been named one of India's 50 most powerful people. Indrani was a socialite, a businesswoman, and a media tycoon. Some people even called her the First Lady of Indian television. But no matter how famous and wealthy Indrani got, she never forgot about her little brother and sister back in Guwahati. And so finally, in 2006, Indrani came back to Guwahati and pulled her younger siblings out of poverty and away from their little house in the alley. Indrani sent Mikhail to a school in the south of India, and then to treatment for his mental health issues, and then she brought Sheena back west with her to Mumbai to go to school at St. Xavier's. So now, when Sheena's phone rang and she saw it was Indrani calling her, no matter where she was or what she was doing, she would always stop and answer that call. She felt like she owed that to her older sister for all she had done for her. When Sheena had first arrived in Mumbai, she lived for a while with Indrani and Indrani's husband, Peter, in their penthouse apartment in a luxury building in South Mumbai. But by late 2007, about 1 year into her time at St. Xavier's, Sheena had found a place of her own. A pretty little flat near her school in a neighborhood called Colaba, right on the Arabian Sea. And while Monday through Friday, Sheena stayed at school or her flat and focused exclusively on her schoolwork, she still found time every weekend to go visit with Indrani and Peter at their penthouse. And it was during one of those weekend visits that Sheena met the man who would forever change the course of her life. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon toward the end of 2007 during Mumbai's monsoon season when it rains almost continually for months. Sheena was sitting on her sister's couch reading a book when, from behind her, she heard the door to the penthouse open. And then she heard a young man's deep voice calling out a greeting to Indrani and Peter. Sheena folded the page of her book, laid it on her lap, and turned around. And there, standing in the doorway, greeting Indrani and Peter with hugs, was one of the most handsome men Sheena had ever seen. He was tall and athletic with dark eyes, high cheekbones, and slicked back jet black hair. He also had a faint British accent. To Sheena, he looked and sounded just like a movie star. His name was Rahul Mukherjee, and he was Peter's son from a previous marriage. Rahul had been living in the United Kingdom, but after getting dumped by his longtime girlfriend, who was upset that Rahul could not keep a steady job, Rahul had decided to return to Mumbai and try to make it in Bollywood. Bollywood is India's film industry. Rahul's plan was to live with Indrani and Peter in their penthouse until he could get established in show business, at which point he would move out on his own. Suddenly feeling a bit flustered, Sheena stood up and made her way over to the door to greet Rahul. When she got to the door, Rahul was bent over taking off his shoes, but when he stood back up and laid eyes on Sheena for the first time, he smiled a big wide smile, and Sheena smiled right back. From that very first interaction, there was a clear spark between Sheena and Rahul. Sheena started arriving at her sister's penthouse for her weekend visits earlier in the day and leaving later. Rahul, who normally liked to go out and party, always made sure he was home when he knew Sheena was coming by. They both loved Bollywood movies, and so they started watching them together in the afternoons. But although Sheena and Rahul obviously liked each other, they were careful not to let their attraction blossom into anything more than just a platonic friendship. They knew that Sheena's sister, Indrani, and Rahul's father, Peter, would frown on the two of them having any kind of romantic relationship. First of all, though they weren't related by blood and didn't meet until they were both adults, Rahul was still Indrani's stepson, which meant Sheena was technically Rahul's aunt, even though Rahul was actually 4 years older than Sheena. But even beyond the very awkward family dynamics, Sheena and Rahul were just two drastically different people. Rahul had grown up rich in England, he went to the best boarding schools in the United Kingdom, and he had never gone hungry a day in his life. He also had a bit of a wild streak in him. As a teenager, he got arrested for growing marijuana, and as an adult, he barely worked, choosing instead to live the high life using his parents' money. As for Sheena, she was hardworking, quiet, and came from nothing. Even at St. Xavier's, which had strict rules about how students could dress and behave, Sheena was considered to be very modest. In short, Sheena and Rahul were total opposites. And so, for the first 6 months that Rahul and Sheena knew each other, they kept a respectful distance between them. But then, one weekend afternoon in 2008, when Sheena and Rahul were alone in Indrani's penthouse, something happened. They sat down to watch another Bollywood movie, but this time, instead of sitting separately like usual, they curled up next to each other on the couch and pulled a blanket across their laps. And then, as the movie played, Sheena and Rahul leaned into each other and kissed. After that first kiss, Sheena and Rahul knew they could not keep pretending they didn't have romantic feelings for each other. And so they decided they would just have to date publicly and accept the fact that Indrani and Peter would most likely not be happy. And Sheena and Rahul were right about that. The young couple very quickly moved into an apartment together located about 20 minutes to the north of Indrani's penthouse. And pretty much the second they finished moving their things into this new apartment, the fighting began between the two couples. Or more specifically, Rahul began fighting with Indrani. Even though Indrani was Rahul's stepmother, he never liked her and certainly never loved her. His own parents' marriage had broken up because his father, Peter, cheated on his mother constantly with younger women who clearly were only interested in Peter for his money. And so Rahul had always viewed Indrani as nothing more than just another one of those types of women. And so very quickly after Rahul and Sheena had moved out, Rahul and Indrani began getting into these horrible yelling matches every time they saw each other. At one point, Indrani even tried to ban Peter from seeing Rahul. However, Peter would sneak out and see his son behind Indrani's back and make sure he had enough money. As Rahul and Indrani fought more and more, Sheena started to distance herself from Indrani and the rest of her family. Sheena also began adopting some of Rahul's worst habits, like blowing off responsibilities to stay out late and party, and at least one time, people saw Sheena and Rahul snorting cocaine together in a nightclub. But despite all the drama around their relationship, Sheena and Rahul remained a couple. And they were still a couple a few years later in 2011, when by that point, Sheena had managed to graduate from St. Xavier's, and she had managed to get a full-time job with Mumbai's metro train system. But despite Sheena and Rahul believing that at this point, their lives were going more or less the way they wanted them to be going, they were in for a shock. One fateful night was about to kick off a chain of events that would not only totally upend their lives, but it would also rock the country of India. That fateful night was October 26, 2011. It was the same day as the most important holiday of the year in India, Diwali, or the Festival of Lights. On Diwali, Indian people celebrate the triumph of light over darkness and good over evil. In Mumbai, the whole city seemed like it was glowing. Lights hung from all the trees and up and down the streets and in front of every home. That night, as fireworks exploded across the sky, Rahul dropped down on one knee inside of the apartment he and Sheena shared and asked Sheena to marry him. For her whole life, all Sheena really wanted was for someone to love her, and now she finally had that. Sheena was overjoyed and started crying happy tears and said yes. Little did she know, this decision would haunt her. Now that Sheena was engaged to Rahul, she felt like she needed to make an effort to try to repair her relationship with Indrani. So, Sheena wrote Indrani an email telling her she was sorry that they had fought so much over the years, and she said that life was just too short for them to be holding grudges. And Indrani, for her part, was reconsidering too. She and Peter were just tired of the constant conflicts with the young couple. And so, on March 10th, 2012, Indrani sent a response email to Sheena, and in this message, she told Sheena that she would always love her, no matter how angry they got with each other. It wasn't long after sending that reply email that Indrani got a response from Sheena. And when Indrani read what Sheena wrote, she instantly felt this rush of fear and anxiety come over her. And so Indrani picked up her laptop and ran to find Peter. Once the couple was staring at the screen together, they both read Sheena's email in stunned silence. In the message, Sheena made it very clear that things had soured with Rahul, and now she desperately wanted out of the relationship, but she said she couldn't do it alone and needed Indrani's help. Over the next few weeks, all Indrani thought about was her little sister, Sheena, and how to save her from Rahul. Indrani checked in on Sheena regularly by email and text. At one point, she even offered to buy Sheena a diamond ring in hopes that might cheer her up. She also told Sheena that whenever she was open to it, Indrani was more than happy to get her set up in her very own 3-bedroom apartment. And while Indrani wished Sheena would agree to that, she knew this was a very sensitive situation, and so whatever Indrani did to help Sheena, it would need to be when Sheena agreed to let her do it. And so Indrani waited. On April 24th, 2012, a little more than a month after Sheena first asked for Indrani's help in that email, Sheena told Rahul that she was going out to meet her sister Indrani for dinner. Sheena asked Rahul to drop her off on Linking Road in Bandra, which is a famous shopping area in a fancy suburb of Mumbai, known for the huge and colorful variety of clothes and shoes and fashion accessories sold by street vendors. Rahul knew that Sheena was talking to her sister again, but because he was still on very bad terms with Indrani, he had actually tried to put a stop to it. But Sheena seemed desperate to make things right with her sister, so as much as Rahul disapproved, he did not try to convince Sheena not to go out and see Indrani for this dinner date. And so, at around 6 p.m. that evening, Rahul, somewhat begrudgingly, gave Sheena a ride from their flat to Linking Road. By 6:30 p.m., they had arrived at the bustling shopping center, and Rahul had pulled his car into a parking space. Sheena leaned over from the passenger seat and gave Rahul a kiss, and then opened her door and got out of the car. Rahul watched as Sheena started to walk into the crowd of shoppers, but then he saw her turn around to face him again. She was wearing a maroon top, jeans, dangly earrings, and her engagement ring, and she was carrying a purse. She smiled and told Rahul one more time that she loved him and that she would see him later. Then she pulled her purse strap up over her shoulder, turned around again, and started walking into the crowd. Rahul could see where she was going. In the middle of the crowd was this fancy silver sedan, where Indrani was sitting in the back seat. Rahul could see there was a man he didn't know leaning against the outside of the car smoking a cigarette, and Rahul figured that was Indrani's driver. He watched as Sheena arrived at the side of the car and bent down to look in the window and wave hello. Then Sheena pulled open the back left door, climbed inside, and shut the door behind her. At this point, the smoking man dropped his cigarette, put it out with the heel of his shoe, then climbed into the driver's side of the car. Rahul watched the silver sedan back up and then start to drive away, and after a few moments, he had lost sight of it in the big crowd.